Good morning.
Morning, Rochelle.
How are you?
I'm doing fine.
I said this earlier, but every time I see your face, it makes me smile. I always feel like I'm in the presence of greatness. So thank you for agreeing to join me. May I ask you to please tell us your name?
So I'm Mark Anthony Neal.
Dr. Mark Anthony Neal. And Mark, will you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your career, what you do now, and some of your work and causes?
So I am the James B. Duke Professor of African and African American Studies at Duke University. I've been at the university since 2004, and my research is primarily on popular culture with a particular focus on the history of Black music, gender and sexuality politics, and Black intellectual traditions.
Excellent. Thank you for that. You and I did a diversity chat, not a diversity chat, John Hope Franklin talk. Uh,
Wednesday at the Center. Yep.
yeah, I don't remember what year now, but it's been a minute, and we talked a little bit about the movie that had come out, Hidden Figures, and we talked a little bit about Black people in IT, and that was really a very informative talk. So today, I'm hoping that you will talk to me a little bit about um, Black men in America and how you see that, and what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which we spend a lot of time always already talking about the lives and the concerns of Black men. But of course, it was brought into a very different kind of relief last year with the killing of George Floyd. And he became almost singularly representative of some of the challenges and tragedies, if you will, trauma, that Black men face on a regular basis, both in terms of our interactions with law enforcement, but so much of George Floyd's story is what happened to him up until he got to that point. The failure of the K through 12 system to nurture him, the way that we always expect and assume that K through 12 will nurture our children, and always seems to nurture the children of our white peers. He was failed on that level, right? He was failed in terms of not having really solid employment opportunities, right? That would allow him to have some sort of sustainability in his life. He was failed, in terms of thinking about what happens in terms of the medical profession, right? He's someone who's addicted to painkillers. The fact that we haven't found a way to deal with better the way that folks deal with pain in this country, and the fact that Black people are often underdiagnosed for the pain that they're feeling, right? As if, somehow there's like this idea that Black people don't feel pain, right? So we don't actually have to deal with their pain in some sort of level, right? And so the tragedy of George Floyd really is everything that happened to him even before those 8 minutes and 40 seconds that most people will remember him for.
And I think what's really interesting about the way you characterize that is it's really a breakdown of our system, or either a non-functional system of Black Americans as a whole, right? So we are usually the first in and the first out. We are penalized in public school for some things that are beyond our control and some things that are within our control. But, if you think about what the Black family looks like, especially through public education, there's a part where the entire education system has failed these children in so many ways. And then we go to cutting budgets, we go to figuring out what's the right size class and all these things without considering the whole child in the process of learning.
Yeah, I mean, the K through 12 thing is tragic on so many different levels, right? We think about the ways that young Black folks are policed in school systems, right? They're criminalized, for behavior that doesn't grant the same time attention when it's done by some of their white peers. The punitive, ways in which we react to Black children simply being Black children, which, almost tracks them into the criminal justice system beginning in second and third grade sometimes, right? The use of, resource officers in schools, that function like an occupying police force in K through 12 schools that we simply don't see in some schools, in some neighborhoods, with some demographics. So it's all of that, let alone the fact there's so little attention to what these young folks are doing in a classroom in terms of the actual learning. And the fact that in a society that is rife with people struggling with mental health care, folks in mental health crisis, there's very often very little support in K through 12, right? Actually to deal with the kind of emotional and mental concerns that our children have.
Absolutely. And the timing of Mr. Floyd's death seems very ironic to me, so it happens right at the start of this pandemic, and more people at home looking at TV or looking for ways to entertain themselves. And so Mr. Floyd's death was played on video over and over and over again for us to see it. And much in white America seemed shocked or astounded by that. But in reality, we know that that has been the case forever. There was a Black man in Texas back in the early 80s, I want to say. Somebody put a noose around his neck and drug him down the street on the back of a truck till his head and his body separate from each other. And the fact that we're outraged about Mr. Floyd, justifiably so, we should be outraged about all this happened to us. I mean, we just saw the anniversary of Tulsa. I mean, like, what is it to be Black that brings so much vigor and violence to us? What is that thing that is such a conundrum that we can't seem to even break free of?
Quite honestly, in the absence of the pandemic, I don't think George Floyd's death rates much attention. At least not any more than Aubrey's death, Ahmaud's death did a few months earlier, or Breonna Taylor's death did a few weeks earlier. The way that white America responded to it always reminds me of the way that white audiences responded to television footage, newsreel footage of the civil rights movement, right? Black folks, the kind of things that we saw on screen from the Bull Connors and folks like that, that's something that Black folks obviously experienced for centuries. But for white America, it was the first time that they had to see it on screen, right? And it put into question their moral beliefs in what America was and what they were seeing on the screen. And even if they weren't all that supportive of Black civil rights, they reacted to that gap between what they believed America was and what they were actually seeing. And so there was a little bit of that, I think, in George Floyd, right? A real disconnect between what folks believed America was, particularly post Barack Obama, right? Even in the midst of the Donald Trump presidency and what they saw on the screen. But I also think it had a lot to do with the fact that Americans in general were feeling a sense of precarity that they had never felt before. And I think historically, Black folks carried the precarity of the nation in a way, right? That when white folks actually start to feel that precarity, they often venture towards the Black experience, right? To have some sense of what that experience is, to how to navigate that experience, right? So, again, we're thinking about this a year later. Last year, more white Americans uttered the term Juneteenth like in the history of America, right? There's no data to support that, but that clearly was the fact, right? The fact that we have folks around the country asking whether that Juneteenth should be a national holiday, in the absence of the precarity of what America was feeling at the time, I don't think we're having these conversations, at this moment.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. But I do think that in a lot of ways, they're done with the conversation now. They're ready to move past this conversation. They're ready to move on. The country supposedly is reopening and, things are getting back to some semblance of normalcy. And I think that people are ready for that to go away. But at the same time, the problems still persist. We still have the same problems that exist because past Mr. Floyd's death, how many other Black and brown people have been killed between that death and today, and we're still seeing it here in North Carolina where we are. We just saw a Black man killed in Elizabeth City, supposedly for trying to run over two police officers, as opposed to he was fleeing, so, there's that part there, and so the way the narrative is almost always told, we are at fault. So we put Mr. Floyd on trial, his health care, his drug use and all these things. He was killed. He was killed, regardless of whatever kinds of shortcomings he may or may not have had. He was killed. And that should be, astounding to people that a man was killed while he was in handcuffs, while he was down on the ground, not like he was, jostling with the
Right.
police or trying to get away, because, they justified, Rodney King's beating because he was high on PCP and he was, too much for them to handle. Well, this is a whole nother version of that, except for
Right.
to an extreme.
Right. Yeah, I see some interesting, comparisons in the conversation that we're having now about Tulsa. As someone, myself that works in studying popular media and media, it was so striking to me the number of documentaries and films and news specials that were devoted to the anniversary, right, of the Tulsa, what happened in Tulsa in 1921. And it's like, you've literally had 100 years to tell this story. Why did everyone decide to tell the story at the same time, right? In the same like 10-day, 2-week period. And we know part of that is market force, right? The market forces, right? It's easier to market this story in this way at this time. But when I hear folks who are activists in Tulsa who are pushing the Tulsa municipality for some form of reparations, right, for the families of those folks who were still there, survivors, right, of what happened, literal survivors in some cases, and obviously the family of those who were lost. And you see the mayor and the leadership of Tulsa literally trying to run out the clock. Right. As I believe the mayor said something along the lines of, reparations at this time will be divisive. Right. And when I heard that, it's like, oh, you're hoping that in all this celebratory moment and this acknowledgement that it's going to go away. Right. And it's not going to be a political issue for you anymore. Right. Because we're already past that. And that's often the way that we dealing with, Black pain and Black trauma. Right. We're looking, even the conversation about reparations now, right, which has more of a foothold in American society, than it has in more than a century. And, the reality is that, folks are trying to wonder when the due date is, right? When will this conversation expire so that we don't have to have it anymore, right? And again, that's the way that we historically deal with Black pain and trauma.
Absolutely. And the subset of that is my ancestors did that. I didn't do that. That's the argument that you hear. Like my ancestors, I had nothing to do with that. I'm not a racist. I'm not this, I'm not that. But yet still you benefited from that, and your society still is that makeup of that society.
And that's the genius, of, the work that Sandy Darity and other folks are doing around reparations. This is not a conversation about how we feel about whether or not you think we're racist or not.
Right.
Right. This is not a conversation about where your heart is. This is a conversation about the economic reality of what this country benefited from the labor. Here is our bill.
Right. Exactly.
Here is our invoice. We don't care how you feel, pay the invoice.
Pay the invoice. Absolutely. And the fact is that we still are in a society where even coming out of slavery, our labor made more for this country than it did for anyone else. Whether it's your generation or your family or not, whatever. So, you get past, slavery. You had Japanese internment camps, they got reparations, or they got some kind of compensation. You had the Holocaust, they got some kind of compensation. Every time that some other group is infringed upon, they are made whole or made close to whole as they possibly can. Whereas we are not, and we are still waiting, so constantly. So you have this thing where voting rights are under attack again, healthcare is under, everything that you could possibly imagine that marginalizes underserved communities is still in play. It's just framed with different languages, so we have mass incarceration. A lot of people call that a new form of slavery, removing the Black man from the family, making sure that he doesn't recover. He can't vote, he can't drive, he can't do anything. And so you have this thing that's constantly spinning like a ball gathering dust.
It's a cycle. Yep.
Right. Absolutely. And in the end, we end up where we are right now, just discussions. And I have told as many white people as I can, stop talking and start doing, so if you look down the hallway and everybody down the hallway looks like you have a problem. And if you don't recognize this problem is going to continue. And so don't hire and pay equally, right? And when we do hire and pay Black people, and that's still a question about whether they actually get fair compensation, you become the go-to person for every Black issue that happens in your organization. So whatever it is, you become it.
It's amazing sometimes, the inactivity that's associated with allyism. As if it's, literally can be reduced to a fist bump or a high five, and everybody's supposed to feel good. Listening to discussions nationally now about, the number of Black women that are tenured in universities and colleges, even at an institution like Duke, there are only 20 Black women tenured,
Right.
At Duke. The percentages of Black tenured folks around the country, and often what we'll hear from these institutions are, well, we're aware of this, we're attentive to this, we need to build better, professional development mechanisms, right, to help people, to mentor folks. And it's like, I'm at the point now that that's all well and good, right? But if nothing you're doing is actually dealing with the racists in some of these departments and the assholes in some of these departments,
Amen.
right, then professional development doesn't do anything, right? And if anything, you're really preparing people to leave, to go someplace else because of your unwillingness to deal with the problems that you actually have at your institution.
Absolutely. So when I was getting my doctorate degree, my professor was a Black woman by the name of Crystal Chambers, brilliant woman. She's got her JD, her PhD. She's done all this research and all this stuff. She applied for a job at our esteemed university and told she was not qualified. Right. Not qualified, right? So I don't know what she was applying to teach, but she was not qualified. And then you have the struggle in Chapel Hill with a woman who did a lot of the groundwork for the 1619 project. And she's denied tenure. So what does it take to get tenure? Must you be white? Is that the qualification or the requirement to get tenure is to be white? Or you toil in the field so long that they have no choice, but to grant you tenure, right? And then that becomes that hold on, we can go further thing, but there are a lot of people that are in these institutions that are not qualified to have what they have, but they have it because they look more like the people who run it and the people who hire and the people who promote. It's just really unfortunate that at the expense of Black people. But I think more importantly, there was a study that was done by the Pew Center, and I think somebody else had done a similar study about pay among people. And the lowest paid person in a professional experience is what? Black man, the lowest paid, right? So you got white man, Asian man, white woman, Asian woman, and then you get down to Black and Hispanic women, and we fall in that little small thing close together to each other. And then you get, maybe 3 or 4 steps down, there's the Black man and where that falls out. And what is the logic of that? Why would a society not want someone who is going to provide and take care of his family to have whatever he needs, what is fair in that space? Because it allows you to keep this narrative going and to do as much as you can to destroy that Black man and that Black family. Yeah. And I think that in essence, we are still stuck at this place where we as Black people haven't yet figured out that great Jim Crow experiment, light versus dark, really still works. It works so well that he did that so well that we haven't figured out how to come together as a people and unify our voices, but we separate, we disintegrate, and we go apart. And here we are still struggling with the same issues that we've always had.
Your point about Black men resonates for me when we think about any number of the killings that we've seen, police killings and otherwise, over the last 15 or 20 years, and the people that we tend to hoist up and celebrate are young Black men. Right. Shamir Rice, Ahmaud, Trayvon, to be 2 examples. We don't talk as much about, say, someone like Walter Scott, right, where we're literally seeing the footage of him running away, right, 12 plus feet away from the police officer, right, when he gets shot. And we realize when we hear his story that part of the narrative is that he was afraid of being arrested for failing to pay child support. Right. Right. And so it's just maddening to think of that. Right. But again, someone like George Floyd, who's 46 years old, we live in a society that doesn't pay much attention to Black men once they age out. Right. right, right, once they get older. Um, and that was something that was really striking about the George Floyd situation also, right? That we had this level of attention, but not for a young, right? Because the narrative is always, he had so much promise, right? And everybody can be invested in a promise that was cut short. George Floyd is at that age where we no longer talk about people having promise, right? Where folks, Black folks, Black women, Black men are throwaways in a society. And so that was really striking also about the way that people reacted to his situation.
Absolutely. And I think that, when you look at Black men as a whole, if you look at places where they excel, right? So music and sports and areas like this where they excel, it seems like society is always perched on the place where we can disseminate or destroy this man. Can we do everything we can? So we love LeBron James. He's everything to everybody right now for a while.
Right.
And it may be because he has enough money and enough esteem that we respect that as a society. But then we have Plaxico Burress, right? So here is a Black man who is doing whatever it is that he's doing, and he walks into a club and shoots himself, and that becomes a crime. Was it illegal to have the gun? I don't know whether it's illegal to have the gun in the club.
Did he probably need to protect himself? Yes.
Right. But that's a problem because we've got to malign him. We make sure in our society we do everything we can to tear down what we don't understand. And that's one of the sad things about Black men. And I'll talk about the piece that's really important to me. So I am a mother and a wife. I have one son and I have a husband, both Black men. And I remember when Mr. Floyd killed, we had this conversation with as a family that Obama's attorney general had with his children. He had talked about on TV of talking about come home safe, right? And you have these conversations with your children and your families, and you're not even sure what they mean to you because, like, how do I protect you once you leave my space? How do I protect you when you're not with me? And then even going to Breonna Taylor, how do I protect you when you're even in my house and they can just kick down the door and shoot me down in my own house? So I think that in a lot of ways, to me, Malcolm X said that Black women were the most abused and neglected people in American society. But I think that might be true in a lot of ways. But I think that Black women hold a responsibility to uphold and to promote Black men as much as you can. And that's where I call the skin in the game, right? You got to put some skin in the game, because if you aren't fighting for these people and you allow people to destroy that Black man, literally you're destroying your family, right? So it's a different kind of genocide, right?
Yeah, I agree with that, but I also think it goes both ways, Rochelle. Particularly when we start to see Black men in professional realms, in places where they might have more influence and more visibility than Black women. Black men have to be cognizant to make more of a space. I think too often Black men and Black women, because of the small numbers of us in certain professional spaces, it becomes more competition, right? We're each vying to be the Black, in a particular space, right? And so I absolutely hear you in terms of the ways that, Black men have to be protected, but Black men also have to be sensitive to the fact that Black women are also going through struggles in these places.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that the way I sense coming out of slavery to even to some portions to where we are now, it is the Black woman who held her family down and got her through, so even during slavery, we were the people that were in the background doing what we can to help and protect our Black men. But, somehow or another, we have become participants in tearing down Black men. We holler rape when the person has money or a person has something so that we can get some attention to us or get something to us, as opposed to realizing we're feeding into what they want, what they think about Black men. How do you get, 4 Black men in the elevator with a white woman, she's closing up her body and holding her pocketbook to her because there's a narrative out there that Black men are rapists and robbers. That's what they do. They're rapists and robbers. So in my mind, I think that as a mother and a wife, these are my precious things. I have a daughter too, so all 3 of my family members are precious, but these are my precious jewels. So how do I keep these jewels going? Because they're going to carry on a legacy. There's going to be another Brown. There's going to be another Harris, there's going to be another. And how do you keep that going forward without protecting Black men? And society seems to be leaning toward destroying Black men as fast as it possibly can, in whatever way it can.
Absolutely.
And so, I want to say, so, your work is well known and people know who you are, but I think that there is something about where you have come from and where you are that really speaks to, a real persistence and an intentionality in your life, because you have done some amazing things. I was watching TV the other night on Netflix, and who's on Netflix but Mark? I'm like, oh my God, look at that. So everywhere. But I think that that's an example for Black men, to see a Black man who, just like everybody else, not like, could jump highest or run fastest, but was persistent and intentional about his career. And I think that that's the example that you provide. Is one of the reasons why I come back to you over and over again, because your story is so phenomenal. I think that your work, you talk a little bit about your books, a couple of books that you wrote. Can you talk about those? So I think that there was one that really, really hit home with me, was when you were talking about Jay-Z, but can you talk a little bit about those books?
Yeah, I mean, they cover a range of things. My first books, What the Music Said and Soul Babies, are really books that were influenced by the music that I grew up listening to. My father, who I often describe as my first interlocutor, even though he dropped out of school in the 10th grade and couldn't read. But it was the first reminder to me that intellectual capabilities, intellectual production was not just arts and letters, right? There are other ways that it could be articulated. And in that work, I was always attuned to issues around gender and sexuality. So by the time I do New Black Man and Left of Black, right? It really is trying to look at a broader range of how Black masculinity exists in our society, right? There are certain archetypes of Black men that we understand, and there are certain ways, particularly these younger generations, in which we push against the boundaries of whatever boxes, Black men are supposed to be. And so Looking for Leroy in particular was about, trying to expand and even blow up some of those boxes that have constrained how we view Black masculinity.
Absolutely. And what's really so amazing about that masculinity, and I always often think this, I watch my husband as he walked down the hall, and I just shake my hand. That's a Black man right there. That gait, the speak, the mannerisms, all those things. And it's so profound to me to just see it,
Yeah, I used to joke about that with Barack, because in those early days, back in 07 to early 08, and when Black folks around the country nationally didn't really know who he was, right? They just knew he had this name, and his middle name was Hussein, and all those kinds of things. And he wasn't legible to Black people in the way that a Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton or so many other folks were legible to them. But then all you had to do was see him walk.
Right.
And it was like, oh no, okay, that's a South Side walk, right?
Yeah,
we know exactly where that is, right? That's the walk that you have to walk to be able to live in certain kinds of spaces.
Absolutely. And what's so beautiful about that is that we try to condemn that. So in this space that we are right now, so it's a lot of young Black men who now wear their pants below their waist. And, I often, remark, you're changing the way you walk. You're changing the entire structure of your body, having to walk like that.
Absolutely.
And what's really amazing about that is, okay, that's a part of this, we're always introducing new things into society, specifically in style and dance and things of that nature. But this introduction is a bit beyond my understanding. So, and I don't condemn it if that's what you think is the right thing. It's just, we've already had so many things alter our body structure, right? So, I have high blood pressure, I have high cholesterol, heart attack, and all these things that I am susceptible to because of the things that have happened to me since I've been here in America. And now I'm going to even change something else about myself. And I'm going to keep changing these things about myself until I either, refine it and become something else, or either I fit into a society where they say I belong. And that's one of the interesting pieces about that. So mass incarceration, right? So there, so I spend a lot of my waking hours watching Netflix kinds of documentaries. And what's really interesting is mass incarceration and how we get to where we are, right? So so many people have threw out the numbers, we're 18, 13, whatever percent of the population, and yet and still we're almost 60% of the prison population. How is that possible? And I guess I know the answer to that question, but is it directly related to racism and discrimination, or is it something else?
I think it's definitely racism and discrimination, and it's over policing. That's just, again, George Floyd is such a good example of this, right? What's been so striking to me the last couple of years in terms of these police interactions is that the premise that begins the interaction in the first place. We're reacting very often to the end game, right? The killing, the shooting. What's insidious to me are the things that instigate to interaction in the first place.
Right.
In my mind, right, is 18-year-old man, right? So, we can't fault him for being who he is. But if someone passes me a fake $10 bill or whatever it was, my first reaction is, I'm not going to take it. Either give me a real $10 bill or you got to leave, right? I don't see any context in which law enforcement should be involved in that interaction.
Right.
When we think about the woman in Central Park, right around the time that George Floyd was happening, the bird watcher, right? And she never gets that what was racist was the premise that you actually threatened to call the police for this in the first place.
Right.
Right? Because white safety in the minds of white Americans trumps
anything
the human
else.
rights of Black folks.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's like, and you all you can do is shake your head. I mean, Sandra Bland, she didn't use her turn signal.
Right.
To switch a lane in which literally there were no cars behind her.
Right. Right. And that's just, so this Netflix documentary I watched it is about in Boston, the scandal in Boston where a bunch of police officers were robbing drug dealers and taking their monies and all that stuff. And what really was interesting is that, when you look at the crimes that these people have been convicted of, $20 worth of crack or heroin or whatever it is, 7 years in prison, 7 years for $20. And he didn't have enough to distribute, it wasn't packaged or made like, who's going to sell it. 7 years for that, which means 7 years that man's out of his family's life. 7 years he's not contributing to the welfare and the productivity of this family. 7 years he's just gone. He's lost out his life. He just might as well take a knife and carve out 7 years. I didn't exist for 7 years because I'm in this system. And that's, not an unusual story. My husband was telling me the other day about a very dear friend of his that got 3 strikes. And his 3 strikes was he had done something to his car window, so it had made the thing look like the window had caved in. And his 3rd strike was driving over the speed limit with that back window. And you're thinking, this man is gone for the rest of his life
for that, right.
For that, and yet and still, when you turn the tables around, when white people are in trouble, we got meth and this opioid crisis. These people have mental health issues. They are not criminals. Right. They are not. They have mental health issues. Was crack not the same thing as methamphetamine? But we were criminalized for it, but they were, and what's really unfortunate about it, because I don't even like to say crack, because crack is portrayed as a Black people's drug, but more white people did crack than Black people. But the way they tell the story, right. We were the crack addicts, because you could put the cameras on New York or Chicago or right. someplace and just, you could see it. So it's just an unfortunate situation. Is there resolution? Is there a chance to get on the other side of it?
I think there are a couple of things to consider. We can't divorce over policing and over incarceration of Black and brown people from the industry that is in fact prisons. The number of small towns in rural America. I have a colleague, John Eason, who's written about, this explosion of rural prisons in which the inhabitants of the prisons are Black and brown, but the prison itself is in a largely white community. And those prisons bring jobs. and they bring other businesses, right? So the prison, unlike the factory of 50 years ago, it's the prison now that becomes the economic hub for a region, right? But of course, you need prisoners,
Right.
right? So Black folks and Black and brown folks get over incarcerated, right, to be able to feed that. There's also a part of me that, you know, when I'm thinking in my darkest about these things, is that you incarcerate Black folks, you remove competition.
Right.
You remove talent, you remove skill. I mean, this is, you know, one of my favorite television shows is The Wire. And when you look at the arc of Idris Elba's character, Stringer Bell, and you see his genius as a thinker on the 3 seasons that he's on The Wire, right? He should have been at Wharton,
Right.
right? Or the Tuck School,
Right.
right? And so to push him over on the side into the drug realm, you know, he doesn't have to compete. You know, he's not competing then,
Right.
you know, with white kids, you know, who are in those spaces.
Right. Absolutely. And what's really amazing about that, so in my darkest space, I even go darker than that. I say there's jealousy and envy, and it's simply the proclivity of white people to think about Black people in a way that you cannot be better than me, so I must destroy you.
Right.
I must destroy you. You cannot be superior. And so what you see in society is they go about a thing of building up these communities of white things, right? So you have a company and the president is white, the vice president, right? Everybody else is white. And you get down to the lowest levels you could possibly get down, you know, maybe 7 or 8 levels deep, and you hire a Black person here, a Black person there, a brown person there, a brown person there. But when you flip that argument on its head, they didn't like indigenous people. They tried to destroy them as best as they can. Hispanic people, as best as they can. Latinx, as best they can. But what they have not succeeded in destroying is Asians, because whatever the narrative is, they are smarter than us. They are more normalized like they are than us. And then you add to that a component of skin, right? So now, and, you know, I guess it depends on how you dissect the world, but, you know, majority of people are this color or lighter than this, and everybody's trying to be lighter so we can be like them, which to me is a complete insanity, because I don't understand that. But they picked out their chosen people. Their chosen people that they've allowed a little bit into the door, not much, but a little bit into the door, are Asian people. And in essence, continuing to promote Jim Crow, because we don't want any of you to be close to each other. We don't want any of you to recognize what's been happening to you over these years and come together as a whole. Because as far as I know, there are more brown people than there are any other people in the world. You know, and if you lump Black people and brown people, then we are a big thing, because we have a big continent and all these other things. But in essence, what we have is we have this separation of, you know, to me, in my mind, it just seems like pure jealousy. It doesn't seem to be any logic to why what happens to people happens. So, you know, a woman trying to get tenure, a person trying to get a job, a person, you know, like, why wouldn't you allow that? You know, because the more diversity, and not race, but the more differences you have in a society, the better your society is. Because if everybody looks like you, thinks like you, and acts like you, you're not going to have very much creativity in that process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I want to go back. Let me just ask one more question about incarceration. So spot on. I think that the prisons become an economic hub in a lot of places, and they make sense. And you can go pick up people off the street and harass them. But that over policing then becomes a part of what's happening. So we saw in 2020 a young man at Waffle House, and Waffle House has got a security guard or whatever you call those people out there, you know, and so he's, you know, thrown around. And you have kids in school, young kids who are being punched and beaten and whatever by people, which what you said earlier, you know, so you're preparing them for criminalization, you're preparing them for incarceration, you're preparing them to not have a voice in society. But how do you fight for that? How do you change this thing in society? So is it a process where we educate our community about the problems of incarceration? So I had this conversation with my son the other day. My son's 22. And I said, you know, so be as polite as you can, whatever it is. But no matter what it is, say I want a lawyer. You know, don't give out any information. Say I want a lawyer, because they can lie to you, convince you that something is true that's not, and so you're vulnerable. So how do we undo a society, or how do we change or at least modify a society that has for so long said these people are bad? Is it something we do in our communities, or is there someplace else?
I don't think there's more to be done in our communities. I think within our communities, we know our value, right? That's the way that we've been able to sustain ourselves for so long. But I think when these incidents happen, we have to be able to coordinate a way to escalate attention. I think what has come out of the last year, and I can think about Elizabeth City as a good example. We've been able to put people under the microscope who thought they never had to be under a microscope before.
Yeah.
I'm sure the part of what the district attorney and the police force in Elizabeth City is responding to is that for the first time, they actually have to be held accountable to something. Right. And the natural inclination was, to push back and to, have stuff disappear and not show the footage and all those kinds of things. The situation with Nicole Jones in UNC, I'm sure the UNC Board of Trustees never expected, right, that this would become the kind of national issue that it is. One of the strategies that my wife and I have had to do, our youngest daughter just graduated from high school, but it was always important that whatever was happening to her in these schools, that the schools actually had to see us.
Right.
Right. That we had to show up 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon to get questions, right? To escalate the situation, right? So that, right, whatever's going to happen, there are folks here who are advocating,
right,
for this child, because what we know is that not every parent has the time or the wherewithal or the privilege to advocate on their children that they have, and the schools know that.
Right.
And they exploit the fact that parents very often won't have the time to advocate in the ways that they need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's something that they are so comfortable with, so you can go into school system, and first of all, the school system does is they test you. You're not that smart. So when you get you an IEP or get you some kind of process that can deal with your thing, how many in the public school system, how many Black and brown children are listed as academically gifted? It's so rare. And you don't even know how to go about that process to get your child labeled as gifted or something, because the system is rigged against you to begin with. So in essence, you're constantly fighting this thing. But I think that it's important that we think about what we do next, because I am pro action versus less talking. Like, we already know all the issues out there. We don't need to talk about this anymore. Reparations should have been done years ago, and they make it more complicated because it's something that Black people will get, and God forbid we should make them whole. God forbid that we should fix what we did wrong. We should not do that, because then they might be real competition for us. Then they might present challenges for us. They might move into our neighborhoods. They might go to our schools, and that won't work, because that's just not how we see ourselves. So I think it's a very complex topic. And I think that we in the community need to help our white friends the same way they came to us looking for help when Mr. Floyd was killed. We need to help them along. We need to help them understand how to get through these processes, because obviously this is not something that they are built for, if you will, to kind of figure out how to undo their mess. So I appreciate you talking with me today. I'm going to give you my last 5 minutes. This is part one, part two coming soon, but this is part one. So Mark, I give the rest of the time to you. Thank you again for talking with me today.
Well, thank you. It's always been a privilege to chat it up with you, especially to take advantage of this digital realm. You've been doing some good work in that regard for a long time, so I'm glad to be able to participate.
I'm glad that you are here. And I promise you, when we do our part two, we're going to talk a little bit about Left of Black. I love that. The New Man. I mean, like, all of these things are just so phenomenal, and I think we should spend a little bit of time for that, because I might give some folks a guidepost on how to navigate some of these things.
Yeah. Yeah,
Especially as you
understood.
go and read and get some information, you see how this is done with people who fit naturally in your community. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I'm looking forward to part 2. Stay well and keep doing what you do.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.